blood. Sometimes I think that there's no blood. So heartbroken that I do up. Now I'm looking for a dirty cup. Yeah, double cup. Two hoes got a double up.
What's good, y'all? Hope you're having an amazing day. Back at it. Shout out Scary Interesting. Not sure if we checked out one of their videos or not, but this one caught my attention. It's a longer video, so we're just going to jump right into it. So if you could, please hit that like and sub. I appreciate you very much. This one's called The Disturbing Case That Still Haunts Siberia. Kazynet? I don't know how to say it, but yeah, bro. We're just going to hop right into this. So if you're alone like I am, I apologize, bro. Especially if it's night, but I'm just going to let this shit ride, bro. Appreciate anyone that chills with me. You already know. Trying to hit 300 subs. If you could help me get there, it's all love, bro. I'll remember that shit forever.
This is Kazynet. It's just a tiny collection of houses.
No
in a single
AI
railroad
generated
in the middle of the
content
Siberian
used.
Taiga.
Shout
On
out.
the night of August 14th, 1989, a regularly scheduled train came through this cold, lonely stretch of woods until approaching something up ahead on the tracks. At first, the train conductors couldn't tell what they were looking at. But when they could, the discovery would be one of the most gruesome and horrifying mysteries in modern Russian history. As always, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. The village of Kazynet.
One sec, y'all. I'm going to move my cam so you can see the subtitles better. That's better.
In Russia is the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps. It's tucked deep within the Siberian Taiga, surrounded by an endless sprawl of pine and birch trees, and it's actually less of a village and more of a scattering of houses along a lonely stretch of railroad tracks. And with a population of about 24 people, there are no shops, signs, or proper roads, just train tracks, a few homes housing railway workers and their families, and a few dirt roads that seem to lead into the forest to nowhere. And given its location
creepy,
in August,
bro.
the nights here are deceptively cold. Summer days can turn to sudden frost, and the sun vanishes quickly. By midnight, the landscape is swallowed by the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're being watched.
Fuck that.
It was in this silence at precisely 1:40 in the morning on August 14th, 1989, that freight train number 2008 rumbled its way toward the Kazynet station.
Kazynet.
This train was massive, 70 cars long, hauled by a heavy locomotive and helmed by two experienced railroaders, brothers Vadim and Igor Supernenko. They'd passed through Kazynet countless times before, but this time was different. As the train approached the station, the brothers noticed something on the tracks ahead. Whatever it was difficult to make out in the sweep of the headlights initially, but Vadim sounded the horn, and at the same time he slammed on the emergency brakes. Unfortunately, a fully loaded freight train doesn't exactly stop on a dime, so despite the brothers' best efforts, they couldn't stop before they heard and felt the inevitable crunch beneath the steel wheels of the train. When it finally came to a stop, the brothers climbed down with their lanterns and started walking along the rails. They were used to wildlife near the tracks, and even debris or the odd fallen branch, but this obstruction seemed completely out of the ordinary. And what they would eventually find would scar them for life. There, spread across the tracks, were the torn remnants of 7 people, although they might not have known quite how many people there were at the time.
Fuck, bro.
What was clear was that there was no movement or signs of life at all, and it didn't take much more than a momentary glance to determine that. The Supernenko brothers stood over the wreckage of what had once been a group of boys and realized they'd just become the unwilling participants of something horrific, something that couldn't possibly be explained by a simple accident. As soon as the dispatcher was alerted, the police from the nearby much larger Abakan station were sent to the scene. Floodlights arrived afterward, villagers were woken up to assist, and the grim task of retrieving the many parts began. Soon their names came in one by one, each one being realized to have come from the small community of Mesterchansk. Dmitry, Nikolai, Vadim, Oleg, Vyacheslav, Roman, and Victor. All of them just 15-year-old friends.
R.I.P.,
They were a
bro.
tight-knit group of boys who played soccer together, attended school together, helped their parents, and they'd apparently gone on a simple weekend trip to collect cedar cones in the forest.
Sad, bro.
Frustratingly though, according to investigators, this was nothing more than a tragic accident. The boys had ventured into the Taiga on August 12th,
Cedar
and by the
cones?
following
They
night
went to
intended to
scavenge
return home on
seeds?
the 10:39 p.m.
Crazy
train.
how times have changed.
Something, however, had obviously gone terribly wrong. Maybe they lost track of time, or maybe they got turned around in the woods. Whatever the reason, they apparently missed their train, and according to the initial report, they allegedly lay down to rest on the railway tracks. Even more strangely, their backpacks were found later lined up about 820 feet or 250 meters away. That detail would be the thing that made headlines: 7 bags placed in a row near the tracks as if part of some kind of ritual or pact. And the implication was haunting, and reporters didn't hesitate to spin it as a possible agreement between the boys to end things. The idea was put forth that maybe it was deliberate. To the parents, however, this made no sense. These weren't reckless, troubled kids. They'd experienced in the wilderness, they weren't known to drink, and the toxicology report proved it, as no alcohol was found in any of their systems. They were all well fed, healthy, sharp, and cared for. The idea that they decided to end things or nap on top of the rails was beyond absurd. Like, for example, if that was somehow the case, how had none of them moved when the train approached? How did they not wake up? Even the Supernenko brothers testified that they weren't walking the tracks, they were lying on them motionless as if placed there. Still, officials pushed the narrative that this was just a tragic, horrific accident. The boys were said to have been exhausted and had made a terrible mistake as a result, and the case was closed. But the parents obviously wouldn't let it go. Something more sinister was at play, they were sure of it. Unfortunately, they had no proof, no support, and no leverage, but they did have grief, which was further sharpened by what they viewed as an indescribable injustice. In the meantime, the people of Mezdorchensk buried their sons in stunned silence, but this didn't last long. Soon, whispers became suspicions, and suspicions grew into fury. None of the families could accept the story they were being fed, and for 2 long years afterward, they pleaded with the local officials to reopen the case, only to have doors repeatedly slammed in their faces. Phone calls were also ignored, and paperwork was somehow lost. It was clear that authorities had no interest in revisiting the tragedy, especially when it meant admitting the original investigation not just been flawed, but possibly corrupt. In the face of this, the families went over their heads in the biggest way they possibly could. In the fall of 1991, they penned a desperate letter directly to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, appealing him to order the investigation to be re-examined. At the time, though, the Soviet Union was crumbling, and the country was spiraling into chaos. The chances were slim that anyone would even read the letter, let alone act on it, but by some twist of fate, the letter found its way into the right hands, and against all odds, it worked. On October 8, 1991, the Prosecutor General's office officially reopened the investigation into the Kazynet deaths. 2 new names were then assigned to the case: Vladimir Guzenkov, an investigator for especially important cases, and criminal prosecutor Yuri Stolyarov. And thankfully, these weren't small-time paper pushers. They were serious men pulled from Moscow to handle difficult cases, and they got to work immediately. They arrived in Kazynet sometime afterward to find that the scene was long erased by time that had passed since the initial discovery. Rain, snow, and rot had stripped away nearly every trace of evidence. They also found that what little had existed back in 1989 had been mishandled by police or outright ignored. Vladimir
Always
then
gotta
began by
listen to
knocking
people,
on every door,
bro.
interviewing every local, and pressing
Not
for
always,
details
but you
again
know
and
what I
again.
mean. If they were
What he
there.
found, strangely enough, was a wall of
Weren't giving
silence.
you
The
red
villagers,
flags.
nearly all of them related to one another, claimed to know nothing. They all said they'd been asleep at the time the train rolled over the 7. As he continued to press, though, Vladimir kept hearing the name Vasily, who was a local man serving time for killing his own brother Slava.
Jesus.
The murder seemed like just another drunken brawl, but in light of the new investigation, it now looked different. Especially when Vladimir learned that Slava may have let it slip while intoxicated about what really happened to the 7 at Kazynet. Upon learning this, he went to the prison, and over multiple visits, he chipped away at Vasily. At first, the story was muddled and it shifted, and then a confession emerged. It was partial and reluctant, but it was enough to really begin to push. Vasily then let slip that he and one of his other brothers, Yuri, had been involved, and just like that, everything the authorities had insisted wasn't true came crashing down. The deeper Vladimir dug, though, the clearer it became that Vasily's story just wasn't lining up. It still seemed he was being deceptive. Vladimir then requested that the families allow him to exhume the bodies. It was a dark undertaking, but when the caskets were opened and forensics experts took a second look, what they found changed the narrative forever. The 7, as had been suspected, had not been killed by the train. Instead, it was determined that they'd been attacked savagely and methodically. And the injuries were chilling in their consistency: fractures to skulls, jaws shattered on both sides, and trauma to the chest and abdomen.
Christ,
Each of the 7 bore the unmistakable signs of blunt objects. Experts also ran tests using biomannequins trying to replicate the wounds, and found a match only when they used the exact tools found in railway depots. It was clear
That's
this was no
gruesome.
accident, and now there was physical evidence to actually
there
prove
not
it, or
blood
at least
everywhere?
investigators willing to not look the other way.
I mean, obviously they got left.
The
there.
Supernenko brothers would then back that up with their testimony.
7 kids.
According to
bro.
the 2 train drivers, when they realized what was on the tracks and saw them in the train's headlights moments before, they weren't scattered chaotically. They were lined up and arranged, placed on the rails exactly where the train would ensure an unrecognizable end. This also aligned with the state of the backpacks, the complete lack of alcohol or drugs in the victim's systems, and the absence of panic injuries. Vladimir's new working theory was that they were ambushed, attacked, and then laid across the tracks.
Duh.
With that, the case file was now a murder investigation, and one with more questions than answers. Because while Vasily had started talking, what he said still didn't make sense. His claim that he and a brother had done this to all 7 seemed unlikely. The boys were athletic and healthy. The brothers, meanwhile, were thin and sickly. How could these 2 men overpower 7 healthy individuals without one of them getting away? This is when the story changed again. Vasily claimed that there had been a third attacker, Slava, the brother that he had later killed. Vasily claimed that Slava had been the one to land the fatal blows, which was convenient since Slava was already gone
All
and
these
couldn't
names are
contradict
sketch too.
Still, Vladimir pressed on. He had a hunch this wasn't just a family affair, and then he managed to get another slip from Vasily. During a separate interrogation, Vasily blurted out a new name, Nikolai. This wasn't the name of just some villager, it was that of a senior police lieutenant from the nearby village who was in Kazynet that weekend visiting relatives. He was also a man of authority and power. When Vladimir caught up with Nikolai, Nikolai claimed that he had left the village well before the incident, and this seemed like an ironclad alibi until the locals contradicted him. Nikolai had been there at the time of the incident after all. Witnesses claimed to have seen him drinking with the brothers and a local foreman of the track crew. They were all together that night and they were consuming heavily, apparently liters of homebrew. Eventually, through more conversation, another name surfaced. A man named Pyotr, who was the foreman's brother, but Pyotr wouldn't be talking to Vladimir. It's not that he refused, it's that he was dead, having apparently ended things not long after the investigation reopened. At this point, things were coming together to form a disturbing picture. Then, during one particularly grueling round of questioning, the local foreman broke. He'd had enough of the constant questions and guilt, so he agreed to tell Vladimir everything he wanted to know. He would then name names, he described the night, he spoke about the drinking, the confrontation, and the weapons. And then came the final revolting truth of what really happened to the 7 in 1989. 2 years prior, the sun dipped below the dense canopy of the Taiga, and Kazynet settled into its familiar nighttime hush. In one of the few houses near the tracks, though, there was a lot of noise coming from men consuming hard. At least 3 liters of homebrew were being passed around, maybe more. And the names around the table were already familiar. There was the local foreman and his brother, there was also Vasily and his brother Yuri, and the visiting police lieutenant Nikolai. They weren't celebrating or mourning anything, they were just bored, and boredom in Kazynet can be a dangerous thing. As the drinks flowed and the evening wore on, they eventually ran out, but that didn't have to mean their night was over. They still wanted more, but the only thing that could be considered a store in town was long closed, so they did what Kazynet men sometimes did when desperate. They went to the train station in search of yashes, which is slang for train cargo handlers who sometimes carry stash for barter or bribes. That night, however, there were no yashes to be found. There were just 7 boys, all strangers to the men, standing near the rails waiting for a train. They would claim that the boys were trying to short-circuit the rails using a piece of wire to trip the signal and stop the next train so they could hop aboard. But that story never held water. There was no wire or proof, and the boys had come prepared to leave on the 10:39 p.m. electric train. They knew the schedule by heart and had no reason to interfere with the tracks, but the men latched onto the excuse anyway. They needed any sort of justification, no matter how thin.
Bro, that's such a crazy excuse.
A confrontation then erupted, voices rose, and then the attack began. According to the confessions, everything started with a police lieutenant. He was strong, muscular, armed, and filled with a sense of authority, and he didn't hesitate. When one of the 7 supposedly mouthed off to him, maybe trying to stand up for his friends or trying to defuse the situation, Nikolai hit him in the head with the butt of his firearm. This was apparently instantly fatal, causing the others to freeze. And for a split second afterward, the boys didn't believe what had just happened. Nikolai then shouted to the other men to finish them off and leave no witnesses. What followed was chaos. Any tools within reach were grabbed, and the men descended like animals. Some of the 7 tried to run, and one of them likely could have escaped, but Nikolai still had his firearm. He then commanded them to stop or he'd use it. Those who were yet to be attacked then froze again, and the men continued until they were all lying in the dirt beside the rails. Afterward, Nikolai, a supposed protector of law and order, directed the others again, this time to stage the scene. A train was due to pass soon, so they moved the 7 carefully and deliberately across the tracks. Then they lined up their backpacks a few hundred feet away to help sell the story that these were just tired and foolish boys who lay down to rest. Then when the grisly task was complete, the men scattered. Later, the 1:40 a.m. train would come through Kazynet, obliterating the remains. By the time the Supernenko brothers stepped off their freight train and walked the track with their lanterns in hand, the men were long gone and the boys were well beyond saving. And with that, the truth, as ugly and deplorable as it was, had finally been revealed.
So horrible.
By the time the case reached court, the entire country was watching. And despite the court convening in 1995, nearly 6 years after the initial discovery, the courtroom was packed with parents of victims, reporters, locals, and just people who had followed the case. For more than 7 months afterward, the trial dragged on through proceedings. And then, finally, when the judge read and delivered the verdict, it was so lengthy that it took over an hour. Nikolai, who led the attack, was sentenced to capital punishment, as was the foreman and brothers Vasily and Yuri. Finally, it seemed justice had been served. This seemed like a rare moment of accountability in a system where things could often be volatile. But just as the men began to wait in their cells, the country took a political pivot. In a move aimed at joining the Council of Europe, Russia began aligning its laws with the European human rights standards, including the abolition of capital punishment. On May 31st, 1996, the first deputy chairman of the Supreme Court of Russia filed a protest. In it, he asked to overturn the verdict of the court and transfer the case for a new investigation. The Supreme Court then agreed, and just like that, everything unraveled. Not only were the sentences tossed out, but due to the convoluted legal mess and procedural timelines, the previously convicted men were released just like that. And they weren't retried or held in custody, they were just set free. And if you can believe it, things got even darker from there.
What?
After his release, Vasily attacked a cousin of his who, according to some, had known everything and wasn't planning to keep his mouth shut during the reopened investigation. Meanwhile, Yuri, who was one of the brothers who was convicted, was also found dead by either suffocation or sudden pneumonia, depending on which report you believe. Then came the most chilling incident of all. A railroad worker who was one of the key witnesses who had helped remove the seven from the tracks was also found under the wheels of a train at Kazynet, allegedly as the result of slipping and falling on the tracks. So as horrific as the initial incident was, somehow it hadn't just ended in 1989. It seemed to have just changed direction, but admirably through it all, the families who had been betrayed and beaten down by bureaucracy kept fighting. By the late 1990s, the story of the Kazynet 7 had faded from the headlines. Other scandals had taken their place, and there were more than enough of those. The country by then was cracking under the weight of corruption, war, and transition, and most people assumed the case was dead, but the parents of the victims were relentless. In February 1997, they managed to push hard enough for the Prosecutor General's office to reopen the case once more, this time under the legal banner of, quote, circumstances not fully investigated. It would take 4 more years, 3 additional exhumations, 5 expert forensic reviews, and more than 100 witnesses. There were testimonies not previously considered, forensics experts re-examining the same broken bones, and mountains of old paperwork that were hauled back out under the light of government offices. And through it all, one name that kept coming out during those years was that of Nikolai. Since his release, he had become a municipal deputy. You heard that right, one of the central figures in the murder of the seven had parlayed his time out of prison into a political seat. But in the fall of 2001, something miraculous happened. The Supreme Court of the Republic of Kakasha issued a new verdict, and Nikolai, the foreman, and Vasily were once again found guilty of the murders. This time, the sentences were final, but to many, they still didn't come close enough to fit in the crime. Nikolai and the foreman were sentenced to just 10 years in a maximum security penal colony, while Vasily got just 7 years.
Bro, they're serial
For the parents,
killers.
again, it wasn't justice. And even then, Nikolai, true to form, never stopped filing appeals. The man who ordered the entire incident still claimed that he was the real victim, and the family simply endured it all. Despite the loss,
You're
lies,
cute, dude.
retrials, and political
All
maneuvering,
you.
the truth finally came out, and it stuck. Not because the
victim
system
after all
worked, but
that.
because the parents refused to let it stay buried. And in the end, they forced the world to look at what really happened on that cold August night in 1989. Kazynet was never and will never be the same as it was before the murder of the
insane.
seven. The town, for all its supposed concern and regret over the
So
case,
still a
always knew
town.
something, and its silence was complicity. What happened there is now more than just an unspeakable crime. It's a cautionary tale about the failure of justice and about what happens when the people in power believe they can get away with anything. If you made it this far,
Bro.
thanks so much for watching. I also want to say thanks
was
for
so
all the
much to
incredible
take
story
in.
suggestions that you've all sent in.
Like, holy shit. Shout out, Scary Interesting. Really good video. That was a lot, bro. Kazynet. I wonder if that... Still an area. Or still a town. civil. That's not what I meant. Whatever, it'll do. Oh, I don't think it has civilization anymore. But anyways, bro, that's gonna do it for me. Let me know what y'all think, bro. They got slapped on the wrist. Like, they should have all been killed. Death penalty, lethal injection, whatever the case may be, all lined up and shot. Don't play victim after shit like that. You did it because you were drunk and bored, bro. Like, we all make mistakes, but that's beyond a mistake. That's just your sick, twisted fantasy. But yeah, bro, RIP to all them. They could have all went on and did something great in their lives. Been a historic figure. Not for the wrong reason, for the right reasons. But it is what it is. Energy transfers, I think, so you never know, bro. But very sad. It's all love. Hope you all have an amazing day. Let me know more shit to watch. If you like these longer videos, let me know. If there were any skips, I apologize. My equipment's old. Got to upgrade. Just really been going through a injury process. Might be getting surgery soon. We'll see. It's all love. Hope you have an amazing day. Let me know more shit to watch, bro.